Hi, welcome to Almost a Poster Workshop. Why is it almost a poster workshop and not a proper poster workshop? Well, in these limited times that we have to skip a couple of components. We don't have the group interaction that's very important to a good workshop, and we won't be able to play with full-size mock-ups, and that I think we'll miss even more. You can do this on your own if you're so motivated. The format for this video is going to be as follows. I'm going to start with a few general words about posters, my own thoughts and things that I've seen to be true. I'll talk a little bit about why we do mock-ups and show you what I would recommend doing if you can swing it on your own. Then we'll go into a short Adobe Illustrator tutorial. You don't have to do your poster in Adobe Illustrator, but it's the application that most design professionals would probably choose. And we'll finish up by looking at some successful examples of former student work from prior classes that I've taught, and list some of the resources that are available for you moving forward. Posters are different. There's something powerful and kind of primitive about them, and I think part of that is their size. If you look at this Polish anti-war poster here, you can see just the simplicity and clarity of message. There's something about working with these larger formats, the typical format for posters and the size that your poster will be printed at is 24 inches by 36 inches. That's a large sheet of paper. If you're not used to working on such a large format, that's one of the first challenges that you'll sort of need to grapple with. But posters are often somewhat disposable. They have a limited lifespan. A lot of times they're for an event or a moment in time. And very often they're for commercial purposes as well. If you look at these Swiss tourism posters, very specific, and sort of humble mercantile purpose is going on here. Posters, though, very often transcend these sort of humble origins, and they can very often define an era or a movement or a feeling. This Shepard Fairey Obama poster brings back a very definitive period and feeling to people who lived through it. And this Uncle Sam poster is part of the sort of American visual fabric. A little more humble, if you're of a certain age, you'll remember this Farrah Fawcett poster that was everywhere for a brief period. Let's talk a little bit about inspiration. It's very daunting if you're not doing creative projects a lot to respect your inspiration and the need for inspiration and to take it seriously. It's really hard to face down a blank page and come up with something out of thin air. So we lean on things that we know, that we've seen. We subconsciously copy things, and that's okay. But what I'd suggest is that what you want to do is consciously and intelligently copy things. And when I say copy, I mean if there's a poster or a work or a graphic or an illustration that you really like the look of, you're not going to take it and use it one-to-one, or God forbid just plagiarize it. But what is it about this that resonates with you? Is it the color? Is it the size? Is it the content? Likely it's a combination of these things. And when you get to be a sort of more attentive consumer of visual information, you can break it down. What is it you like about this? And say, that's something I can use in my own work. Sometimes it's the last possible thing that you could imagine. For example, this famous Leonardo da Vinci painting, known sort of colloquially as the Virgin of the Rocks, was my direct inspiration for a SketchUp, an industrial SketchUp rendering that I did. And you can see the similarity here in the triangular composition. And that's what I remember from years ago when I first saw this Leonardo painting. And one of the things that the prof emphasized was the solidity and stability of a triangular layout. And I absolutely had this in my mind as I was setting up the SketchUp work. I saw it, at a in a moment of inspiration. I'm like, well, that's what I want to imitate. And so that's smart copying. That's smart use of visual materials, if a little, convoluted. A lot of times we have a situation where the rules of what we can show are very strictly prescribed. In academics, this is sometimes the case. Our own branch of academics in urban planning and public administration is a little looser. And to some extent, how you present your data, how you present your work is going to be a function of how rigorously academic that work is. Here's a case in point, a poster I did for the Northwestern ophthalmologists. And this was for a medical conference, and it had to be absolutely serious and just sort of dry, almost aggressively academic. And I've seen a lot of posters like this. If you don't actually want to go to the trouble of designing a poster, you can use a well-worn format like this, and it's perfectly fine. But I would suggest that only if your data is correspondingly academic and serious does this format make sense. Here's another poster that was done by a former student, and she was a science grad student, and she was studying Iapetus, one of the moons of Saturn, I think. And again, she was going to a scientific conference, and there's not a lot of room for to deviate from certain expectations, things that have to go on here on the poster. Both of these posters, the ophthalmologist's and Amanda's poster here, have an awful lot of text and an awful lot of notes, and that's the norm for sort of pure academic posters. For us with planning, I mean, certainly there are straight, serious academic works, and your project may be one of them, and a academic format might be appropriate. But for the most part, we're given a little more leeway, I believe, in this field. And I think our poster has the potential, at least we're allowed for it to grow a little bit. And the ideal for me, I think, would be to have some of the emotional power of a visual poster, but some of the restraint and some of the professionalism of a straight academic poster. I think this poster makes that case and hits that sweet spot nicely. There's a lot to like about this. First of all, it's undeniably got that bold impact, and largely because of the large text and the limited color palette. It's a very bold move to do something in black and white and gray and transparent yellow. Yellow is a very difficult color to work with, and here it's used with great effect. And this looks to be something, I don't speak or read German, but it seems to be some sort of like plan for growth, a future growth, and it's got a lot of things that planners like. It's got some maps, it's got a cross section, small multiples of globe, and minimal text, just enough text to explain the work. And it's really, really kind of a good layout. You can see it's based on a simple grid, lots of very strict grid, in fact, very sort of modernist and useful way of approaching any kind of page layout, whether it's a letter size page or a poster. And you probably don't even notice it at first because there's so much going on. But if you take a close look, you'll see that the background is a crumpled piece of paper, which is just sort of very rock and roll and but subdued and just very cool. One of my favorite planning posters, even though I can't read a word of it. What happens to us when we get older? Why do we forget that we like to draw? Why do we suddenly care that we don't know how to draw? I'm going to tell you something, and you're probably not going to believe me, and you're probably not going to do it. But what I recommend is, before you start any project like this, is that you don't jump right to the computer, but you mock something up by hand. Doesn't have to be neat, doesn't have to be presentable, but just something for you. You're putting marks on paper without the interference of a keyboard, mouse, and screen. If I jump right on the computer, I know what's going to happen. There's going to be very few surprises. There'll be some surprises, maybe, but a very narrow range of surprises. But if I'm working with my brain, my eye, and my hand only, things can happen. Other things can happen that I don't foresee. Good things can happen. Once you start putting marks on paper, good things start to happen. And so I'm going to tell you anyway, even though I know you're probably not going to do it. But I would recommend, if I was laying out this poster, I would not start right on the computer. I would definitely start by laying something out, and laying something out full size if you can. And full size for us for posters is typically architectural D size. That's 24 by 36, and either landscape or portrait. And if you don't have access to large paper, just tape small sheets together until you get the size you need. And if you have grid paper, all the better still. You won't need to use any measuring tools, and you'll have nice straight lines. So step one, just tape up a sheet of paper and think about the physical fact of what you're about to produce. It can be daunting. Maybe we'll start in by laying out a margin. A lot of people that don't work on graphic documents will make a mistake about the margin, and they'll lay out artwork all the way up to the edge of their paper because they don't realize that it is paper. They think it's on the computer and you can work right up to the edge, but you cannot. You have to allow room for a margin. Otherwise, when you go to have it printed, the printer will scale to fit and add a margin for you. And it's much better to work with a margin and incorporate it into your layout than to be at the mercy of whatever possibly uneven and too small margin the printer will add for you. What we're looking at here is a 1-inch margin all the way around the page. And I've also laid in the center lines also, just so I have some idea of the visual center of the poster. Sometimes this empty page can look a little daunting. Just grab a pencil and just make a squiggle, make a mess on there, loosen up a little bit. Doesn't have to be a serious thing. This is supposedly fun. So that's a trick I learned in undergrad. I did an undergrad in industrial design. And anytime we were struggling with the blank page, we would just make a bit of a mess on it and then either incorporate that into the design or just work on top of it. You start to realize how making marks isn't such a serious thing. You can recover from a squiggle. You can do anything. It's a working document. It's not a finished masterpiece. So when it comes to actually laying out the content, what you have, let's call those assets, will largely determine what is possible in terms of layout. If you don't have map data, why would you use maps? If you don't have anything on that's time sequenced, why would you have a timeline, and so on? So it's hard to give a blanket sort of advice about what your layout should look like without knowing what your assets are. But anyway, be that as it may, you can make some choices based on what you think is possible with the assets that you have. And by the way, you may not be done collecting assets. You may have a lot of quantitative data, and maybe you need a map or two or three to get across, to complete the picture of what the quantitative data means. Maybe you've collected the raw quantitative data, but you're not sure how you're going to actually display it, or you display it in a bar graph and it just is dead on the page, so you need to do something else with it. So this looks like a lot of stuff. I did what I suggested you do. Just put it up and start playing with it. So here's a first idea. I was going to do something with a grid, but I think when I get to Illustrator, I'll do something on a strict grid. So this is my idea for a map, and it's going to be about the Cold War missile installations in Chicago, the missiles that we used to have placed in Chicago on the lakefront. I was obsessed with this for a while, so I know I have a few assets on this, and I can throw together something quickly. So let's look and sort of examine the different components that we have on here. Some of these will be familiar. title at the upper left-hand corner, identity at the lower right-hand corner. This is straight from the academic model. Why do we do it that way? Well, even though it's a poster in its large format, we tend to read it like a page, which is from upper left to lower right. So unless you have some other great idea or graphic imperative to do it a different way, I would always start off by laying out your title in the upper left-hand corner, identity at the lower right-hand corner, and you're off to a pretty solid start, and leave enough room. Underneath the title, I'm suggesting a capsule description. And what that is almost like an executive summary. You're deep in the woods of this project. You know everything about it. You have to remember that the the viewer knows nothing about this. I mean, your client, if your client sees it, they'll know about it, sure. But a lot of other people are going to view this poster too. So keep in mind your audience. They're likely to know something about um, PA or planning, but they don't know the specifics of this project. So break it down, spell it out. What is the project about? A lot of people skip this step, and then the viewer is forced to interpret, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. What is this poster about? It's got all this data and these maps, but what is it about? So don't make it hard on your viewer. Tell them what it's about. And the rest of this is a sort of a mishmash of things that I might put on a poster. In this case, I'm going to start by thinking that my map might be my featured visual. So I've located that in the visual center of the map. The visual center is the center and up a little bit. We like things, if things are actually centered on the page, they look low to the human eye. So if you want something to look centered, put it in the center and then just scooch it up a little bit till it looks right. So I'm just assuming, I don't really know what my assets are yet at this point, but let's say that the map is going to be the feature that's going to anchor the rest of it. Then I have this sort of radial idea that other aspects of my story will be tied into the map with these leaders, 1, 2, 3, 4, moving around the map in a sort of radial fashion. I'm thinking I might have a temporal component. So how about a timeline along the bottom? Make sure your timeline moves horizontally from left to right. That's the traditional way of doing it. And if there's a traditional way of doing it, use the traditional way of doing it. Don't take this opportunity to try and reinvent the way people are already used to reading something. If there's, if you want to use a color for stop, don't use green because it works better on the page. There are certain conventions that are well established, and you should always use those when possible. And then I'm thinking maybe on the in the right hand column, I might have some small multiples of quantitative data, some charts and graphs. And if I actually had all these assets, I think I might be on my way to making a pretty solid poster. Other things you can gain from working with a full-size comp: get some idea about how big the text should be. So I'm just going to lay out a little piece of a title at 2 inches. Is that big? It's certainly huge. If you're using Microsoft Word, you would never go with a 2-inch font. But for a poster, it's not excessive. It's very big and bold, but it's not really excessive. So I can put this on the wall. I can step back and I can start to see what 2-inch text looks like from halfway across the room. And one of the rules of thumb or cliches about poster design is that they should work from 3 different visual levels. They should catch your eye from halfway across the room. They should work from a couple of feet away, and they should also have some fine detail that rewards a closer viewing. So different levels of data within your overall message, and based on sort of graphic legibility. Something to keep in mind, maybe a way of polishing when you're polishing your final product, when you're almost done with it. In this picture, you also see the relative size of an architectural D sheet of paper next to a letter size document on top of it there. It's quite a bit larger, and it does take some getting used to. And this is just an idea. I haven't committed to anything yet. I may change this around once I bring it into the computer. I may decide that something's not working. So don't be afraid to just have a draft. Design is an iterative process. So here's my first draft. Here's how it looks now. May use all of it, may use some of it, I may use none of it by the time I'm done. But I've made a start, I've put something on paper, and I've learned a lot more than just by sitting here looking at a blank screen or a blank sheet of paper. With that, I think we can go ahead and move on to Illustrator. And I'm going to start another video because YouTube tells me that I can't go beyond 30 minutes, and I know I can sort of prattle on a little bit. So we're going to end this video and pick up video 2 for the rest of this presentation.